night, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. Our first lecture of the semester, Aga Khan Program, lecture series, and evening with. We have 3 lectures and 1 symposium this semester. I'm going to give you the dates so that those of you, and some of you are actually extremely loyal companions in this lecture series. We have also even a beautiful poster. But the first lecture is, of course, tonight. The second is going to be by Ahmed Abdelazim, another one of our postdocs this year. So he and Elizabeth are the 2 postdocs that we have here. And that's going to be, when is it? God, this thing is designed in ways that I can't. March 10th, same room, same time. It's also a Monday. And March 16th, I'm sorry. Yeah. And the title is In the Name of God and the People, the Mosque and the State in Socialist Egypt. On Thursday, April 16th, we have a co-sponsored lecture with the department where we are inviting a young architect, Bangladeshi British, by the name of Ali Manjera, who has done really fabulous mosques and other communal buildings, and he will be reflecting culture and projecting identity through architecture. That's basically what he tries to do in his own architecture. That's going to be in the space called the Long Lounge, which is the 4th floor, room 7429. It's the Long Lounge of the department, and this is where they usually have their lectures. And finally, organized by our own graduate Courtney Soon, there will be a symposium on Saturday, May 23rd, with the title Critical Historiography as Method, a symposium in honor of Nasser Rabatni, that is. And this is to announce the Festschrift that is being organized by my students for me. It's going to be in the Dreyfus Lecture Hall, which is the MIT Media Lab building, the 6th floor. And if you get tired or bored by the lectures, there's a fabulous view from the room, so you can actually just look out to the river if you don't want to listen to the lectures. And it works. Actually, I've tried it before. So I look forward to seeing as many of you in all of these, some of these, and thank you again for being here. Our speaker today is Elizabeth Rauh, who is an assistant professor of modern art history and visual cultures at the American University in Cairo, AUC. She focuses on the history of arts and visual cultures in Iraq, Iran, and the Persian Gulf, countries, of course, that are going up in flames as we are speaking. Dr. Rauh received her BA and MA degrees in Islamic art history at Indiana University, where she first co-curated the exhibition, The Graphics of Revolution and War. You can see that from her youth, she is very much into revolution and war, Iranian poster arts in 2010-2011. In the wake of the revolutionary movements across the Arab world in 2011, she published her first research article, An Enduring Monument, Bahrain's 2011 Pearl Roundabout Protest. This is the article that brought her to my attention. She and I actually ultimately collaborated on a few things, but where she examined the transformative effects of iconoclasm in spurring new creative forms of dissent, as well as the increased politicization of Shia religious practices after the Bahraini people's attempted bid for revolution in 2011. She began her doctoral studies in the History of Art Department at the University of Michigan, and she was awarded the Rhonda Saad Prize for Best Graduate Paper by the Association for Modern and Contemporary Art of the Arab World, Iran, and Turkey, of which there are 2 members in this room. For her project on the Lebanese artist Walid Raad's 2012 conceptual installation with the Louvre Islamic Art Collections in Paris. Her interest in contemporary artists' experiment with Islamic heritage has continued through subsequent research and curatorial projects. Alongside her academic scholarship, she contributes to public educational programs around the Middle East, including public workshops on ecology in Islamic and modern art history with the MISC Art Institute in Riyadh and at the American University in Cairo, where she served as director of the Visual Arts Program since 2023. These collaborative endeavors and research experiences support not only her next book project on ecological art practices in the Persian Gulf. Again, I mean, all of this is resonating in my mind. Look at the ecology now. What's going to happen with the kind of pollution that is being spread now? But also help plant seeds for future collaborations between Islamic art history and the environmental humanities in facing our global climate crisis. Her research has been funded by the Academic Research Institute in Iraq, the Dar al-Funun Center for Modern Contemporary Art in Amman, the Max Weber Foundation, the Historians of Islamic Art Association, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. This year, she is a postdoctoral research fellow at our program here, the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Art Architecture at MIT, in support of her first book project, Lighting Fire to Tradition, 1960s Artists' Experiment in the Islamic World. Her talk tonight, which relates very much to that topic, is I Light Fire to the Tradition. So we move from the indefinite to sort of like a very active verbal form in here. Radical art practices in 1960s Iraq. Contrary to common assumptions, modern artists in Iraq have experimented with Islamic traditions to generate avant-garde artworks and radical concepts drawn from revitalizing historical and religious practices. Keenly aware of the powerful mobilizing forces and emotional resonances of Shi'i mourning ceremonies, they sought to wield popular religious mythologies into new symbolic registers and creative experiments in the face of entrenched colonialism and encroaching authoritarianism. Turning to sacred traditions and popular votive materials, they enlisted Islamic traditions as critical grounds for art making and participating in both local political challenges and a globalizing art world. Such revival or reactivation of sacred content into contemporary art making reveals how political resistance commingled with Islamic traditions in modern Iraq and elsewhere, of course, in the region. Just a note of personal interaction with her. She's a fabulous organizer of panels and conferences, because not only she organizes the panel, but she also organizes the dinners throughout the conference. So you sort of like are taken care of from beginning of conference to the end. So I always look forward to being on a panel that she is organizing, because I know that there will be a few dinners associated with it. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Rauh.
Thank you very much, Nasser. You're easy to keep entertained, luckily, but I'm grateful for your support and mentorship for many years now as well. And thank you all very much for coming and attending this evening to hear my research, which I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts and feedback on as I try to shape this into the book as well. And I also want to just give a shout out to Ahmed and also Diana in the IPEA office for all their help and support this year. Do I need to do anything else for the Zoom to record, or it's good to go?
Just make sure you're not muted.
How do we do that?
The microphone has a red line across it, I think.
I don't know which one's your microphone.
I think we're good.
Are we good? Okay. Do you want to lower the lights a little bit? And can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Not that one. Ooh.
Is that better?
That's
Yeah,
worse.
this is better.
This one? I think it's a glare on the screen, is it not?
Yeah, it's not as.
Well, this is when you have too much technology.
I know.
It was fine the way it was.
This one?
No.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's better. Okay. All right. Onwards. On February 8th, 1963, military leaders of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party successfully overthrew the Republic of Iraq and its Prime Minister, Abdel Karim Qasim. Retroactively historicized as the Ramadan Revolution under later presidents including Saddam Hussein, the violent 1963 coup led to mass executions of not just political leaders, but thousands of citizens and activists, including Iraqi Communist Party members and sympathizers. Iraqi historians describe this so-called, quote, reckoning of the communists, end quote, as a relentless house-to-house hunt targeting merchants, journalists, guild members, students, and especially university faculty that led to no less than 5,000 deaths.
Muted.
We're muted? I don't know what to do.
Could you please unmute?
I think people in the Zoom. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Thank you.
We need to mute them.
How come that there are people speaking?
Yeah, they shouldn't be able to speak. They're going to interrupt me if I'm talking. How do we mute them?
Make sure everyone clicks mute everyone upon entering.
All right. Where was I? So, while ensuing power struggles led to continued political upheaval over the next several years, the February 1963 coup and its catastrophic massacres left an indelible impact on public memory, civic life, and political and cultural expression in 20th century Iraq. In response to the mass arrests and executions, artist Mahmoud Sabri produced a painting depicting the visceral turmoil of the 1963 massacres. Titled The Hero, or Al-Battal, the work portrays a man shrouded in a white tunic and staring out from the gallows, as people mourn and protest around his stoic figure, highlighted against a fiery orange sunset. Sharp crystalline forms and dramatic shadings compose men and women as if out of stained glass, as their dynamic gestures and stylized anatomies contrast with the steadfast central male figure. At his feet crouches another body in white clothes, drenched with red blood. Where a head should be below appears only a void of the human body's outstretched neck, disappearing into another woman's robes, as you can see down here. A small child, composed largely in red-toned pigments, appears next to the decapitated body, suggesting rebirth from the bodily sacrifices of these white-clothed prisoners. Altogether, the painting suggests an eternal cycle of resistance to oppression will be reborn through the heroicized sacrifices of Iraq's everyday martyrs after the violent 1963 coup. Created as a tribute to the large-scale massacres, as well as to the artist's slain friend, ICP Secretary Hussein Ahmed al-Radi, Mahmoud Sabri drew upon not just his artistic training in Russian austere stylized realism at the Surikov Institute in Moscow, but also on previous representations of Iraq's communists and their government executions. Before the 1958 revolution overthrew the Kingdom of Iraq's Hashemite monarchy and propelled the Iraqi Communist Party into governmental positions of power, political organizers had long endured persecution under the British-backed Hashemite monarchy. Brutally repressive state policies towards grassroots organizing since the 1930s led to several prominent communists being executed in 1949, a moment the Palestinian historian Hannah Batatu has argued is when, quote, communism became surrounded with the halo of martyrdom in Iraq, end quote. Indeed, one of the executed activists, Yusuf Salman Yusuf, otherwise known as Comrade Fahid here, reportedly exclaimed moments before he was killed, quote, a people that offer sacrifices will not die. Communism is stronger than death, end quote. Many compared the 1963 massacres to the 1949 executions of Iraq's communists, a historical parallel emphasized in Sabri's painting through the symbolic white shrouds of the doomed political prisoners. Sabri's visceral artwork suggests some of the emblematic artistic responses to the 1963 military coup and subsequent political persecutions. As an exemplar in luminous pigment, the hero demonstrates how Iraqi artists, both at home and abroad, mobilized transnational leftist iconographies, including stylized revolutionary figures associated with socialist realism, into symbolic representations of martyrdom grounded in Iraq's historical visual traditions. Suhaila Takish has previously discussed how Sabri's painting includes figuration taken from ancient Sumerian cylindrical seals, along with Christian symbolism. Such references demonstrate how representations of martyrdom and bodily sacrifice have diverse symbolic associations across Iraq's cultural and historical landscapes, which artists had wielded in modernist art experiments since World War II. But by the 1960s, images of radical sacrifice were becoming increasingly associated with the religious practices and symbolic worlds of Shia Islam. As the second largest branch of Islam, Shia Muslims revere the family of the Prophet Muhammad, like all followers in the Islamic faith, but view his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, as the rightful political successors and spiritual leaders of the global Muslim community, or Ummah. After the Prophet Muhammad's passing in 632 CE, tensions mounted for decades between followers of the Rashidun, or rightly guided leaders, and the Prophet's surviving family, up to the assassination of Ali in Kufa in 661, near the modern Iraqi city of Najaf, and culminating in what became known as the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. This pivotal event in early Islamic history unfolded on the sandy plains near the city of Karbala on the Euphrates River, where the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, was killed along with a small group of soldiers and members of their family by the Umayyad Caliphate's army. On the 10th day of the battle, remembered as the day of Ashura during the Islamic month of Muharram, Hussein was slain and beheaded by the enemy soldier Shimr. Over the centuries that followed, religious rituals mourning and honoring Hussein and the martyrs at Karbala developed among the region's growing Shia communities. By the 19th and 20th centuries, these public mourning ceremonies had become extensive across the Islamic world, but especially among majority Shia Muslim communities of Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, and parts of South Asia, where remembrance of the family of the Prophet Muhammad and the 7th century Battle of Karbala percolate throughout Islamic artistic and material traditions, as you can see here in this monumental wall-sized canvas painting that's now held at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. During recent centuries of foreign colonization and imperial domination, popular memorial traditions centered on the memory of the martyrs of Karbala have presented modern dissidents and activists in the Islamic world a ready-made model through which to channel revolutionary struggles against oppression and injustice. Through the visual traditions and street mourning processions for Karbala, contemporaneous struggles for freedom, justice, and independence have been represented as historically rooted, universal, and religiously righteous. These mobilizing mechanisms and the salvific imagerial power of Karbala, or the Karbala paradigm, as coined by anthropologist Michael Fisher, received extensive scholarly attention after the 1979 Iranian Revolution and subsequent establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Less examined have been the ways in which modern artistic practices and creative experiments engaged and enlisted Shia Islamic traditions to create radical new images, meanings, and ideas across the Islamic world during the anti-colonial revolutionary movements of the 1960s. Returning to Iraq in the aftermath of the 1963 military coup, we can see how stories of martyrdom in Shia Islam became a vehicle for highlighting increasing political oppression and imprisonment of people following the Ba'athist Party's power grab. after the mass arrests and executions of the country's leftists, the revered poet, communist, occasional political prisoner, and lifelong dissident, Muzaffar al-Nawab, composed his famous work, Watariyat Laylia, or Night Strings. In this epic poem, recorded primarily on audio cassette tapes smuggled into the country and later published in Beiruti magazines, he states, quote, "If you come back today, your proponents would attack you and call you a communist." Here, Muzaffar al-Nawab is speaking directly to Ali, or Imam Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad and father of Hussein killed at Karbala. Besides the clear geographic proximity between the 1960s massacres and the 7th century ones, poets and artists created new works further asserting a sense of shared historical injustice between the past and present. These creative expressions provided a potent and imminently accessible framework for symbolizing the corruption of ruling authorities and the brutal oppression of Iraq's political martyrs and that of the Prophet Muhammad's family. Turning now to explore more artworks, historian Hana Batatu's claim that radical politics in mid-century Iraq increasingly commingled with the radiant aura of the pre-modern martyrs in the sacred grounds of Kufa and Karbala becomes even more apparent. The powerful utility of the martyrial model, as transmitted from Shia Islamic traditions into 1960s modernist experiments, can be seen in the painting by the Iraqi artist Kazem Haidar. This work offers a markedly different compositional style as well as representational mode for concepts of revolutionary imagery and martyrdom. In Death of a Man, Masr Insan, or alternatively titled The Struggle of the Hero in some primary sources, Kazem Haidar depicts a deadly battle scene. In contrast to Sabri's luminously prismatic realism, Kazem's sketched human forms appear like two-dimensional flat cutouts whose sinuous musculatures are visible through semi-transparent flesh. Across the whitewashed wood surface, black rectilinear shapes contour and define the central military action in the main field, apart from side flanks of soldiers and horses. The compressed pictorial space offers figures in differing scales, from the giant semi-nude man standing right of center to the uniform row of petite, black-robed, and facially veiled figures assembled near the outcropping of white tents, as you can see up here. Zooming in closer to the painted wood surface, the earthen tone forms are delineated by thin white striations, almost like scratches across bodily limbs, as the natural wood grain surface patterns peer through the pictorial image to invoke swelling sands of a desert landscape. Along with a giant figure holding a double-pronged sword, the mythic reality of the painting is conveyed by a bright yellow and orange anthropomorphized sun, known as the Khurshid Khanum, or Lady Sun figure in Persian and Iranian arts, up here, whose upside-down visage stares out across the painting with her one long yellow ray extending down towards a bloody, decapitated head. As you may have guessed, Kazem Haidar's painting represents the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. On the final day of battle, where the Prophet's grandson Hussein was killed by the enemy soldier Shimr, the modern artist chose to represent this climactic moment immediately following the martyrdom of Hussein by presenting his head held aloft in the air by Shimr, at whose feet lies the rest of the Imam's body, which is identifiable by the green tunic, the color of Islam, and also one associated with the Ahl al-Bayt, or Prophet's family. By depicting one of the most significant events in Islamic history, Haidar's painting reworked long-standing Shia artistic traditions into a revolutionary, redemptive narrative for the presentist sacrifices of ordinary Iraqis. Haidar's interest in Shia Islam grew both at home and overseas. While studying painter and theater design at the College of Arts in London in the late 1950s, Haidar became interested in the German playwright Bertolt Brecht's work and writings on epic theater, or the use of dramatic performances as both a public forum and critical medium for inciting political ideas and audience self-reflection. Kazem Haidar linked Brecht's concepts to popular street theater back in Iraq, namely the Shi'i religious processions and ritual performances known as taziyeh. In these public dramatic reenactments of the Battle of Karbala, local communities insert themselves into the roles of the martyrs and enemy Umayyad army to collectively relive the tragic events that unfolded at Karbala during the holy month. Taziyeh performances, also known as passion plays, are one of the main vehicles through which Shi'i Islamic traditions have circulated and visually dispersed around the world. Due to their visceral emotional atmosphere and the seemingly inevitable audience self-insertion in ongoing political oppression through witnessing a reenactment of the sacred Battle of Karbala, Taziyeh public performances were banned in most countries during the 19th and 20th centuries. Along with popular street productions of Karbala, for Death of Man painting, Kadam Haidar looked to historical Islamic visual traditions, including print prototypes, to shape his revolutionary transformation of Karbala. With ascendant mass media technologies of the early to mid-20th century, including lithographic prints and popular religious posters, artists across the region had increasing access and exposure to older Islamic votive arts through new reproductions and circulations of these pious images. One such color offset poster titled The Tragedy of Karbala by Hussein Latifi unfolds the narrative events in multiple vignettes around a centralized battlefield. And this specific poster is one of many actually held here in Cambridge at the Harvard Fine Arts Library collection. This brilliantly pigmented work from the Adabiya bookshop in Tehran sometime in the 1940s is intriguingly similar in layout and flattened bird's eye perspective to Kadam Haidar's condensed, more painterly rendering. Haidar's artwork clearly shows his familiarity with historical Shi'i Islamic narrative arts, where the story of Karbala is visualized through sequential vignettes circulating around a central battlefield between Hussein and Shimr. The artist was thus acquainted not only with taziyeh public performances, but also versions of this or other popular posters and religious paintings. For centuries, Islamic votive arts and crafts have actively circulated into and across Iraq as part of a wider network of Muslim pilgrimage routes, especially by Iranian pilgrims. These devotional materials and images were often carried to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, and by the early 20th century, this lightweight, eminently portable and reproducible poster became one of the key mechanized mediums for mediating Islamic artistic traditions into modernity. And so here is another poster example showing the familiar compositional layout of the Battle of Karbala, and you even can see the Khorshid Khanum, Sun Lady, up here again. Besides propagating Islamic visual traditions through his modern experiments, Kadam Haidar's reworking of Karbala also raises a number of questions in terms of global contemporary art. Why did artists in the Middle East increasingly engage and experiment with historical religious materials in the 1950s and 1960s? Several artists and schools, such as the Baghdad Modern Art Group, were already preoccupied with issues of local cultural heritage, and especially ancient pre-Islamic forms and content. Yet in the face of political repression and rising authoritarian governments, artists sought out popular visual materials that existed within and participated in everyday life, and thus were actively accumulating new meanings via the material matrix of ongoing socio-political events and changes. In this sense, these resonant popular religious, or sometimes what's called folk art, provided artists a means of expanding traditional representational modes and mediums by drawing directly from the shifting symbolic worlds of everyday culture. These creative developments paralleled the rise of mass media experiments in what became known as the British and American pop art movements. Art historian Thomas Crow has described the pop art drive of the 1950s and 1960s as a creative archiving of mid-20th century image repertoires, explaining, quote, "The pop artist style, an instrumentation of which registers today to us as folk, but at that moment in time was simply representing the contemporary idioms of these regions." Crow goes on to describe the long march of pop, or artistic experiments with popular vernacular materials, stating, quote, "Art objects possess a special strength as a site of endurance and memory. The pop attitude had enlarged rather than narrowed the capacity of fine art to capture and channel deep but inchoate feelings in populations normally indifferent to its customary exclusivity and sanctification." In other words, the mid-century artistic embrace of popular culture sought to narrow the gap between everyday life and the elite art world by resonating with broader audiences in reviving some of art's signifying functions and allegorical ambitions. Considered within this broader context, creative experiments with popular Islamic materials can be understood as also participating in global art world currents by making art that is simply and socially to the point. Haidar's painting of the Battle of Karbala illustrates how historically layered inputs, or what you might call a longue durée of Islamic art traditions, could serve new, democratizing art goals. Likewise, these experiments empowered artists to speak a common, everyday language through immediately recognizable imagery and allegorical narratives. 1960s experiments with the symbolic cosmos of Islamic historical and modern religious practices thus provided Iraqi artists, poets, and intellectuals alike new critical forms of world-making, despite the diminishing representational resources available to them under encroaching regimes like the British-backed Hashemite monarchy or the new Ba'athist Party regime with its strong affiliation to Iraq's ruling Sunni upper classes. This brings us to another question. Who is the modern Karbala painting's heroic warrior? Looking at the giant male figure, we see him grasping the split-pointed sword of Hussein and his father, Ali. Known as Zulfikar, or the legendary two-edged weapon gifted from the Prophet Muhammad to his son-in-law Ali, the sword is a popular talismanic image due to its purported protective properties, as well as its status as an object image stand-in for the heroic Imam Ali. However, rather than depict Ali, Haidar painted a towering, anonymous man in a white shroud whose stance and bare chest recall other depictions of Iraqi prisoners in popular protests, including in this painting by artist Abdul Qadir al-Obeidi, which is a tribute to Iraq's July 14th revolution of 1958. Against a sea of faceless demonstrators carrying signs and banners, the painting shows an enormous male figure standing triumphantly in front of a prison cell with a dove in one hand and an amputated foot in the other. Having broken free of his shackles, the bare-chested, muscular man raises up high a bodily trace of the sacrifices borne by those who fight against tyranny, while the dove, an idealist symbol in mid-century global solidarity movements, offers a visual promise for a more just and peaceful future. On the ground beneath the protesters lies a bleeding, trampled body, while to the revolutionary figure's right, another pair of feet further attests to the vestiges of violent torture under oppressive rule. Much like Mahmoud Sabri's The Hero, al-Obeidi's painting encapsulates the progressive visual culture of the Iraqi Republican era with images of popular dissent, bodily sacrifice, and common participants of the new nation's women, laborers, and farmers. Yet, with escalating power struggles of the Ba'athist government against other political forces, including the Iraqi Communist Party, Iraq's 1960s radical imagery became increasingly affiliated with Shi'i Muslim iconography. While this shift speaks to artists' creative interests in a popular Islamic visual repertoire, it also further aligns with the broader progressive and nationalist context of the 19th and 20th centuries in the Islamic world, including in South Asia and especially Indonesia, where the tragedy of Karbala became a mythic framework through which reformists shaped and defined class consciousness efforts. Indeed, as the Iraqi political sociologist Fala Jaber determined, Even as Marxists and other social reformers fought against forms of consolidated religion, they sought to use the visual language of Karbala as a present and future-oriented worldview. Most especially, as Sayyid Akbar Haidar has argued, leftist organizers across the Islamic world have utilized and simultaneously transformed Shi'i Muslim collective memorializing practices into, quote, outlets for ideas of universal justice, resistance to colonial and post-colonial categories, and the building of transnational solidarities, end quote. In Iraq, communist groups marshaled these so-called Shi'i leftist sympathies through active sponsorship of Muharram ritual processions and patronage of other religious activities, political efforts that only increased following the violent 1963 military coup. As a supporter of the Iraqi Communist Party, Kazem Haidar was highly versant in these increasingly linked Shi'i Muslim and Iraqi leftist activities. His depiction of a heroic Iraqi prisoner, or perhaps a doomed communist martyr, reveals how artists flexibly wielded and participated in transforming Islamic traditions with the figure of a revolutionary Iraqi carrying Ali's sword, Zulfikar, in the middle of the 7th century battlefield of Karbala. Projected through the mythologizing aesthetic and symbolic frameworks of the martyrdom at Karbala, national political struggles in 1960s Iraq attained extraordinary significance as they joined an enduring fight against oppression since the beginning of Islam. Other artworks from the 1960s demonstrate the malleable world-making potential of Shi'i Islamic imagery for contemporary art experiments in Iraq's intensifying political climate. In this painting by artist Naziha Salem, we see figures, shapes, and architectural forms floating over the canvas, coated in pigmented washes of blue and light green. A radiating sun-like halo frames an equestrian figure's profile as the rider and his brown horse encounter a statuesque white animal figure in front of a floating gold dome. Contrasting with the artist's typical depictions of domestic life and women's labor, the dreamlike atmospheric composition reveals her playful interest in symbolic forms loosened from their semiotic contexts, except for the double-pronged sword of Zulfikar hanging across the anthropomorphized white horse. Given the presence of the sword and an amuletic shield without a human rider, the creature may be Zuljana, or Hussein's white horse at the Battle of Karbala. Distinctive within Naziha Salem's artistic corpus, this untitled work suggests the intoxicating appeal of Shi'i visual and apotropaic traditions as they gained new registers of revolutionary meanings. After the mass persecution and executions of Iraq's activists and intellectuals, Haidar expanded his knowledge of Shi'i traditions into a large-scale solo exhibition at the National Museum of Modern Art in 1965. Entitled The Martyr's Epic, or Muhammad al-Shahid, the exhibition series of 32 paintings recalled Shi'i oratory and poetic traditions, memorializing Karbala, as Salim al-Bahloli has discussed. The Iraqi-Palestinian artist and writer Jabra Ibrahim Jabra wrote that Kazem Haidar began his Death of a Man, or Struggle of the Hero painting around 1958, while the artist was still studying in London, and perhaps finished or revised it after the 1963 coup. So the rough sketchiness of the revolutionary Karbala scene, in comparison with some of these other examples from the 1965 Martyrs Epic exhibition, supports this sort of working timeline. Moving through time and space and accumulating new connotations along the way, much like the story of Karbala itself, Haidar's contemporary art object augmented the allegorical capacity of Hussein's martyrdom and may have been the initial spark for Haidar and other artists' work on the rest of the images of Karbala. One work, for example, from the 1965 exhibition, reveals 10 white horses alone on a desolate indigo landscape against a blackened sky and blood-red sun. The riderless animals reference Hussein's famous white steed, Zuljana, or the White One, which is one of the most powerful votive images symbolizing the act of witnessing and remembrance of the tragedy of Karbala. Haidar used the martyrs' riderless horses on the empty battlefield to attest to the bleak social reality of post-1963 Iraq, while reminding viewers to remember and reflect on the many absent martyrs from daily life across the country's present-day landscape. The bodies of martyrs from both 7th century Karbala and modern Iraq become further enmeshed within Haidar's abstracted representations, as in this painting titled Shimmer and the Martyr. In an iconoclastic subversion of the battle scene, the upper canvas edge cuts off Shimmer's head, leaving only the red enemy figure's body astride a paint-smudged horse to face off with an upright figure inside the close-cut pictorial frame. So while we absorb the skillful sense of color and composition in this stylized battlefield, Haidar's painterly and abstractive experiments with Shi visual motifs serves another purpose: to hide overt political content or criticism of the Ba'athist regime, especially in the wake of 1963. The abstracted figures also recall the mutability of the Karbala narrative, especially during ritual taziyeh reenactments, when members of local communities assume the roles of the story's martyrs and enemies and take part in a liminal performance of the mythic battle. As such, Haidar's experimental reworkings of Shi votive forms elide temporal distance and merge recent political narratives of revolutionary martyrs into a revitalized or reactivated sacred landscape of Karbala. The 1965 Martyrs Epic painting series cemented Haidar's aesthetic and political interest in the emotional resonances of Shi Muslim rituals and popular traditions. After the large-scale public art exhibition, artists' explorations and world-making expansions of a Shi symbolic cosmos flourished. The impact of Haidar's experimental work has been attested by several of his contemporaries, including artist Dia Azawi. Azawi himself was known for his work with different lineages of Iraq's cultural heritage. Before Haidar's 1965 exhibition, Azawi's interest had been primarily focused on ancient archaeological artifacts and pre-Islamic Mesopotamian objects and images. But 1 year after Haidar's solo 1965 exhibition, Azawi produced Folkloric Mythology, a painting that plays with Shi votive forms, including a green banner hanging off a metal alam standard and the sword Zulfikar hanging off of a riderless horse. The steed floats high above the Telluric horizon against a whitewashed canvas, while an elongated black rectangle with gold architectural motifs serves as a flattened, iconic stand-in for an Islamic monument. The structure framing a golden dome is likely a reference to Imam Hussein's shrine in Karbala and echoes Naziha Salim's floating shrine dreamscape from 1963. Expanding the potent memory and visual memorialization traditions of martyrdom in Iraq, Dia Azawi painted another work in 1968 titled Al-Shahid, the Martyr. Appearing on the canvas like a shadowy dream or nightmarish portal, the painted image shows a horse in a barren, dark gray atmospheric realm without horizon or sun. Extending above the horse's riderless body, positioned within geometric scaffolding, rises a single decapitated head. Created the same year as the definitive 1968 Ba'ath Party political coup of Abdul Rahman Arif's government that sealed Iraq's governing fate for the next 37 years, Azawi's depiction of the martyr leaves open-ended whether the viewer is witnessing a figure from the 7th century or from Iraq's 1960s political violence. Moreover, the abstracted scene again sidesteps overt depiction of specific political or military figures and thereby evades censorship under a new repressive regime. In characterizing this new Shi cosmic direction for his artistic practice, Dia Azawi published several essays on the impact and evocative power of experiencing Kazem Haidar's 1965 exhibition in Baghdad. He recalled in one 1992 magazine interview, quote, "In the complicated political conditions that followed the bloody coup of 1963, there was a spiritual need for subjects of this sort, subjects that went beyond the common subjects of Bedouins, cafes, souks, and others taken up by artists in the 1950s. Haidar tried to introduce something else into the artwork, forms taken from a popular tradition and transferred to the structure of the canvas, forms charged with popular emotion. Kazem's works incited young artists to search for a new vision, sometimes in metaphysical depths and sometimes in epics, end quote. Azawi's characterization of Iraq's 1950s art scene and its prevailing fixation on modernist bourgeois art subjects corresponds with what Huma Gupta and Suhaila Takish have argued was a camouflaging of poverty and strife in mid-century representations of the country. New art-making experiments with Islamic visual symbols thus fulfilled an urgent need described by Azawi for representing the quote-unquote real political conditions through unlocking deeper allegorical potentials in the modern art object. Such world-making possibilities blossom in the artist's 1969 painting titled Ashura Day. Here, Azawi further abstracts pious symbols in Muharram morning rites into an otherworldly, deep blue cosmos. Created in 1969, the work depicts a swirling mass of popular religious shapes and forms, including, again, a riderless horse, and several panja, or five-fingered hand emblems, referencing both the Prophet Muhammad's family and Hussein's standard-bearer and half-brother, Abbas, who lost his hand to the Umayyad army while attempting to fetch water during the Battle of Karbala. Floating bright red letters amid other Arabic writing clearly exclaim, Ashura. Through Azawi's cornucopian rendering, the holiest day of Shia mourning and commemoration becomes an active arena for abstractive experiments and representations of martyrial sacrifice. Karbala's symbolic realms were adopted and transformed into new radical configurations in the unstable political terrains of 1960s Iraq. In response to the 1968 coup, Dia Azawi and friend and collaborator Rafa Nasri formed and organized the first of several New Vision exhibitions. A printmaker by training, Nasri displayed several large painted wood panels as part of the exhibition called Colored Horizons. Without access to a printmaking press at that time, reportedly due to government confiscations, Nasri lacquered in the center of one dark red abstracted landscape a cutout woodblock calligraphic banner. Printed on the beige linen cloth in black ink is a calligraphic cartouche surrounded by decorative cypress tree motifs and vegetal bands. The text reads, Ya Aba Abdallah al-Hussein al-Muslim, or O dear oppressed Hussein, one of the most common sayings in Shia Islam, repeated during public processions and mourning ceremonies. As part of his research on Arabic script and local printing practices, Nasri actively collected popular devotional engravings across the country, including religious textiles and engraved metal standards carried during Muharram. Yet the artist's stockpile of Islamic piety gained renewed political value in the aftermath of the 1968 coup, when all Ashura and other public religious ceremonies were banned by the Ba'athist government. Community leaders of political groups, such as the communist-trained Islamic Dawah Party, were sponsors and participants in 1960s Shia mourning processions, events that would often transform into anti-Ba'athist government protests. So you see why they banned them. Such political impetus is ingrained in Shia Islam's mythic narratives, remonstrating against injustice and oppression, as eternally symbolized by Hussein at Karbala. Much like Kazem Haidar's radical Karbala paintings, Rafa Nasri's mixed media work with these ceremonial materials not only engaged with popular Islamic visual traditions, but helped to further repurpose them towards expressing political dissent. Both Dia Azawi's abstracted works and Rafa Nasri's print experiments with votive calligraphic materials speak to how artists could arrive at working with and reworking Islamic art traditions through many different creative ambits. Other artists carried the torch lit by nascent 1960s radical art practices into the 1970s. While many leftist intellectuals, including artists like Dia Azawi, were forced to flee Iraq amid Saddam Hussein's ascent to power, some continued working with the new symbolic worlds and creative possibilities afforded by this imagery. These works by Fuad Jihad and Mahmoud Ahmed suggest that despite the eventual destruction of Iraq's leftist groups, the roots of this political visual culture, or new Islamic avant-garde tradition, persisted. In 1986, the social anthropologist Talal Asad presented his groundbreaking new publication, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, challenging the history of Western academia's objectification of Islam's historical traditions and practices as monolithic or static. Asad criticized the textualization of religious behaviors or social life and instead redirected scholars towards a deeper theoretical understanding focused on dynamic aspects of social life. Asad argued for recognition of real-world practices and tradition, claiming that within Islam's discursive history, debate or contention about what is tradition is inherently a part of the Islamic tradition. Such thinking can be applied to Islamic art and architectural history, which likewise has never been stagnant. The idea of religious traditions or artistic heritage as innately flexible ties back to these mid-century creative experiments, where artists marshaled historically sacred motifs for new political purposes. These radical artworks engaged with the mobile objects and visual repertoire of Islamic artistic traditions, including other popular genres, like depictions of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, or Miraj. On this miraculous journey, starting from Mecca to Jerusalem, the Prophet rode a mythical creature known as Al-Buraq across the skies and into the heavens above. Jabr Ibrahim Jabra wrote of Kazem Haidar's 1967 modern rendition of the Miraj, quote, "His Buraq is in part the horse of the Prophet's night journey, and in part the soul's journey through the dark blues of man's endless night of mystery," end quote. Over in Syria, artist Fetteh Mudaris also painted a stylized rendering of Al-Buraq in 1974, in the wake of the Arab-Israeli October War and Hafez al-Assad's implementation of the permanent constitution, reinforcing his power and that of the Syrian Ba'athist Party. Contemporary art representations of the Prophet Muhammad on his night journey were produced for different reasons and carry different connotations. But as Talal Asad has argued, that is the inherently discursive reflexivity of Islamic traditions. Altogether, these artworks speak to transnational interests of artists across the Middle East during the globally transformative 1960s towards popular Islamic images and materials, including in Iran, where the Sake Khaneh group, or what some art critics in Tehran once called Shii pop art movement, there, radical art practices took shape, especially after the 1953 coup d'etat of the socialist Prime Minister Mossadegh and subsequent repressive politics and cultural policies of the Iranian Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The specifically leftist mobilization of Shia Islamic rituals and practices by political groups since the 1950s, including the Today Party in Iran and the Iraqi Communist Party, fundamentally injected political undercurrents into artistic engagements with the mythic story of Karbala. Remnants of the 20th century politicization of Shia Islamic visual expressions can still be seen today, most notably in government-sponsored propaganda of the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially in the height of the 1980s Iran-Iraq War, or though you may have seen some recently over the bombing and death of Khamenei this past weekend. But other legacies also endure. For instance, corners of Iraq's public spheres since the 2003 U.S. invasion reverberate with the martyrial mythologies of the 1960s. In one digital photograph that circulated virally on Facebook in late 2016, the entrance to a meeting headquarters of the newly unbanned and revived Iraqi Communist Party is adorned with large poster images of Imam Ali, Imam Hussein, and the slain Prime Minister Abdel Karim Qasim, along with a hammer and sickle and other radical paraphernalia. These new artworks of the 1960s demonstrate one trajectory in which artists began to see, study, reimagine, and physically harvest and mediate popular religious cultures into the modern work of art. Engaging with Islamic heritage provided artists like Kazim Haidar, Nazih Salem, Dia Azawi, and Rasa Nasri, alongside poets like Muzaffar al-Nawab, an incendiary creative fuel for self-expression and formal experimentation. Islamic visual and cultural traditions supplied creative intellectuals a pliable historical framework through which to channel a relevant cultural patrimony into the transnational landscape of modernity, all the while navigating the political stakes of artistic expression in mid-century Iraq. While these examples speak to the ever-broadening interests of artists across the region in popular religious history and mythologies, the specific leftist mobilizations and political activations of Shi'i Islamic practices by the Iraqi Communist Party introduced heightened symbolic connotations to these artistic experiments, including with the salvific rituals of remembrance of the sacrifices borne by both the martyrs at Karbala and those in modern Iraq. And I want to conclude with one last image. As we've seen, artistic experiments with Islamic heritage addressed real-world political concerns and representational dilemmas in visual arts and poetry alike. Dia Azawi's 1968 drawing, The Tragedy of Karbala, was produced as part of the artist's long-standing collaborations with the poet Muzaffar al-Nawab for his print publications. Born to a famous family in Najaf, Muzaffar al-Nawab grew up intimately familiar with Shi'i religious chants and thereby the representational methods and conceptual possibilities they afforded Iraqi dissidents in the tumultuous 1960s. The poet once declared of his radical experiments with Shi'i Muslim oratory and poetic traditions, quote, "I light fire to the Islamic tradition." Such revolutionary spark can thus be seen across creative expressions throughout 1960s Iraq. Thank you very much.
Will you take your own questions?
Sure. We're happy to do it.
This matters.
Do you want to stand behind the podium and pause?
Sure.
If you want.
Yeah.
Questions?
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I found this idea of reinterpreting the Shia symbols in a communist movement amazing. And
And again, it's
yeah,
crazy.
and it's, as Nasser started this talk, it's very relevant to what's currently happening. Yesterday I was reading some sort of an article on Khamenei and by an Egyptian and Khamenei is not popular in Egypt, but the one who wrote this article seems to have loved the guy. And he was saying that Khamenei held in a great position of respect and love, or really was inspired by Nasser, but also Sayyid Qutb, which was kind of very weird to me because Nasser and Sayyid Qutb, for those who know them, seem antithetical to each other. So, but what they both share is this idea of revolution, right? So, I think it's fascinating to see kind of the years before the Iranian Revolution.
Yes.
Which I assume was some sort of leading to this major triumph of this movement.
Yeah.
So my question is there or was there some sort of political theorization of this sort of reviving the martyrdom and Shia spirit in some sort of political ideology, kind of incorporating it to the political movement in the streets? This is one thing. The other is, what about other artistic mediums like novels and films? Is there anything that plays along these lines? Thank you.
Thank you so much for excellent questions. So in terms of theorizing this sort of latent framework or narrative of Karbala lending itself towards revolutionary activism and movements, it starts in the 19th century during the British colonization of South Asia, especially. I mean, it goes back through the centuries, but that's sort of when it begins to take on more radically this linking between global leftist revolutionary movements and also then the pre-existing sort of Shia Islamic religious rituals, because it's very big, especially in modern-day Pakistan and parts of South Asia. Actually, Rauh al-Nasri, with a few other artists, went to Pakistan in the 70s to see Muharram there, because it's so vibrant and rich. But it actually starts in the 19th century, and then from some of the research by scholars who work on the history of Shia Islamic practices, from South Asia, they sent copies of the Communist Manifesto to Iranian clerics in Qom, who then translated it into Persian, which was before the Constitutional Revolution during the early 1900s in Iran. And then the clerics in Qom sent copies of Marx to Najaf, and that's when it was first translated into Arabic. And during the 60s, there's reports. I haven't found this material yet, so if anyone knows of like the pamphlets and propaganda of the 60s, usually by like the Communist Party and Dawa party groups, but they were distributing copies of Karl Marx translated into Arabic on Muharram in the Mawaqib heading to Karbala too. So this like linking just kind of happens within like sort of the vibrant material and expressive nature of what was happening during the holy months as well. So there's been scholars who've argued that that is just something that inherently has been embraced and channeled through the worldview of Shia Islam. And what I've seen also is scholars argue that the essential destruction of attempts for these revolutionary movements of the Two-Day Party in Iran and of the Communist Party groups also in Iraq is what then gives rise to what became the Islamic Republic of Iran and other more conservative militant interpretations of Shia Islam, including that of Hezbollah also. So the rise of those groups since the 70s and 80s is in part been theorized to be a result of the destruction of this historical, more leftist engagements and attempts. Remind me your second question?
Other artistic meetings, like
Yeah, so that's something I'm actively researching now, is how extensive. I think there might be some experts here with us this evening who can speak more to the film and theatrical and novel history of this. I'm primarily been focusing on the visual arts and poetry because it's a lot to work through. But it was happening across cultures. And it wasn't just happening in Iraq and Iran. There's other examples of martyrs who served in like medieval Islamic history who served as revolutionary figures in other parts of the Arab world, like Al-Hallaj, for example, which Dr. Nasser Rabat first kind of clued me into that many years ago. So it's not exclusive to Shia Islam, but this is sort of where my research has always been drawn and where I've gotten a lot of focus, because I was interested in the Islamic Republic's propaganda, and then I went backwards, and that's how I found this material. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent talk, thank you. To sort of pick up on that last question, I was wondering in terms of other expressions, if you thought of architecture, I'm thinking specifically of Muhammad Makiya, who was Shia, and it's just striking when you're talking about this use of classical Islamic motifs, that he was very interested in that in his architecture in a way I think that other contemporaries weren't as much. I'm thinking specifically of Chaudhry's interest in pre-Islamic forms, whereas Makiya really was interested in medieval Islamic or classical Islamic motifs and architectural ideas. So I just wondered if you had looked into architects at all, if you see any connection.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's another great question. I've seen some of Makiya's drawings, but in terms of architecture, projects, and sculptures during this time, like there's a Martyrs Monument, which then Saddam destroys, but that's a reference to, Tak-Kisra, the Tasifan as well. I haven't come across as clearly overt engagements with the ideos of Karbala in architecture. So if you've seen any or have any in mind, I would be curious about, because I tried to, but it didn't kind of come across as immediately as a lot of the visual artistic works during that time did. And perhaps because the sites of Karbala and Najaf and like the physical locations of these structures were very already sort of being politicized, because there's a lot of massacres happening in Najaf and Karbala also. I do think the readings of the tents that you find in some sculptural and architectural works could also be read or shaded more in sort of like, again, this like larger milieu of how these materials and images were being sort of radicalized or given new meanings of revolution during this time too. But that's something I'm still sort of looking into as well. So it's a great question. Thank you.
And there's also the Kufa, I think there's Kufa Gallery in London, which was a space for artists.
Yes.
That might be another venue. I'm not sure if there's anything that he did with Shiism specifically, but
it's a great question. When I've worked with Dia Azawi, so Dia Azawi's still alive in London, and an amazing archival research and resource who's tremendously supportive of young scholars working on it. And he's talked about sort of, it was more, you didn't see it leave Iraq as much. It was really during this time in the 60s versus other attempts and sort of other expressions in the 70s and 80s. They're still playing with some of this, but it's not as like directly immediate in terms of like depicting Karbala in this revolutionary moment at that time too. But yeah, we'll definitely talk to you more about this later.
Hello, thank you. That was a wonderful talk, and these aren't images I've seen before, and so it was really wonderful to learn about them more. And I'm curious, kind of going off of those, because of your focus on the art object and these as paintings and work, I'm curious how you're considering, I don't know, maybe that physicality, but also things like collecting practices and how these are displayed and where they're displayed, kind of beyond just necessarily the history and iconographic aspects of these, and if that has been significant in your work.
Absolutely. I learned about these works through these artist collections, actually. So I was in Amman for several years working with May Muzaffar, who's a very famous art critic and poet, and her husband was Rafa Nasri. So she had his collection, and I found he had those prints, those banners, and I'm like, why was he collecting these? So that's sort of how I also got interested in this material before I even knew about the rest of some of these paintings and works. In terms of who has collected a lot of these paintings and works, Kazem Haidar's works were exhibited at the Sursak Museum in Beirut the following year. So a lot of his works ended up being collected by a lot of interested sort of curators and collectors in Beirut and beyond. And then you also see them extend into the UK. This painting in particular, luckily, stayed in Iraq and is currently now in the Ministry of Culture of their modern art collection in Baghdad currently, because a lot of paintings have been lost, but they also just keep popping up on Christie's and Sotheby's. So that's like how I found some of these. And Naziha Salem's work was just, that actually only appeared after I had finished my PhD. It's now at the Burjeel collection, so Sultan Qasimi in the Gulf too. So those of us who've done field work on modern art history and archives in the region know how challenging it can be to locate these sources, and especially when it comes to modern Iraqi art, because during the 2003 U.S. invasion, we bombed the Modern Art Museum, including the attached library, which was the greatest archive and collection of modernism for the Arab world. So a lot of that also has made this sort of research challenging but rewarding. So in terms of the meaning of who's collecting these specific sort of artworks and paintings, it's a just kind of a hodgepodge. But what's interesting is that most of these artists were actively collecting those religious posters I showed too. So that's also how I'm finding these modern Islamic materials, is so many artists in the 60s and 70s were actively collecting those at the time too. So it's sort of like it's like the Russian nesting doll, collections within collections of doing research on this time as well. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Congratulations. Very illuminating, and I love the narrative over the ages and times.
Thank you.
I want to, yeah, right. I want to build on what the gentleman just said, namely the use of Shia symbolism for a communist cause,
Yeah.
which is, you know, a different world, different ideology. So did that happen? Did that happen in another period of time? Specifically, did Zulfikar and the hand of Fatima, that I would like to call it, did it start with Shia, or did it exist before that?
You're saying in terms of communism or revolutionary praxis?
No, the symbolism here.
The symbolism.
Yeah, did your research take you before to pre-Islamic periods?
That's a wonderful question. I've tried to stay focused in the 60s because there's so much material, but I think definitely that is something that Diaz always talked about. Like, he's very much like, you know, whether it was pre-Islamic or the Islamic, it was all a part of the same purpose.
Yeah.
So that definitely is a part of it. I've just narrowed in on the specifically Shi material to bring
Right.
it to attention. But it's a great question.
These are very powerful symbols, and
Absolutely. And also, to add further, within the history of Shia Islam since the 7th century, it's argued that a lot of practices and rituals come from the pre-Islamic Mesopotamian civilizations as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So my follow-up question is, you mentioned Talal Asad and his theory. Could you repeat that thought? I did not catch it.
Absolutely. So, it's essentially that Islamic tradition, like most traditions, is a discursive one. So the debate about what is or isn't tradition, so the dismissal of certain practices of being not Islamic or whether they're Islamic, specifically, again, about Shia Islam, Talal Asad tells us that inherently is the Islamic tradition, that debate itself. So it's more of a giving agency to practices of everyday people and are contributing to the Islamic tradition, not just a very strict textual or canonical history. So it was a revolutionary sort of publication across different fields, not just Islamic studies and Islamic history as well, and one that's been incredibly helpful as an art historian engaging with both modern and Islamic artistic materials, if that helps to clarify that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. I echo everybody's praise and excitement over the material, and it really is fantastic to see how much just the many new vectors of analysis that you brought to this research over the time that I've seen you working on it. It's really incredible to see. And I was particularly struck today by your linking of this material to kind of international movements in pop art.
Yeah.
And I was ringing in my head is both talking about the ready-made and the martyrial model, like the ready-made model. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that, because of course when I think about, when I think about pop art, of course, I think a lot about the kind of emptying of meaning that happens from popular symbols. Right, that there's no there, right? Marilyn Monroe just becomes a icon, right? She's not a person anymore. There's, to me, right, in my kind of reading of it, that there's an emptying of meaning and an understanding of the ways in which those images become kind of almost nothing and then given to this capitalist model. Mm-hmm. So in thinking about, it strikes me that you're kind of redefining pop art a little bit through Islamic traditions in this case, which I find really interesting and exciting. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, kind of how you understand pop art resonating in this part of the world at this time. But similarly, I think that discussion also really, and in looking at these images again with you and having you read them for us, it's like, I kept thinking, but what of surrealism? And if that's kind of entered your brain at all, of course, surrealism and pop are linked in many ways, but just there seems to be something, too, in the kind of surreal aspects, both of reenactment of these traditions and maybe imaginings of what this moment in Islamic history was like, that maybe open new doors of consciousness to not just kind of straight ahead revolution, but a rethinking of kind of collective human experience in these moments, if that makes any sense as a question. So your thoughts on surrealism in this practice as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about the pop art first, because it's not me redefining it. It's Thomas Crow as well. So his work I mentioned, he talks that pop art started in the 1930s. So it actually that archival drive predates what we think of as Andy Warhol, what became later associated with sort of mass production and the factory. So the emptying of semiotic meaning from the artwork and embrace of mechanical reproduction as well. Though again, Andy Warhol is playing with icons and different aspects of image making and the power of the image, plus the aura of celebrity, and where is the personhood or subjectness within those kinds of prints. So it's seen globally, and there's different pop art movements that has actually been in publications and exhibitions, including Chinese pop art in the 1980s, which was taking on both, again, the revolution there, and then different appreciation of an anti-capitalist pop culture too. So the methods, and again, that archival sort of interest of tapping into everyday life, but again, what does that mean? What's the material structure of everyday into the artwork, takes on different shape and different forms in different parts of the world. So what was everyday popular culture at this time in parts of the Islamic world, we see is a lot of these posters. You do see also some magazines and advertisements and prints, but the concern, especially in the US and the UK, with the hyper commercialism of everyday, the rise of so much print advertising around the everyday life, you couldn't escape advertising. It wasn't quite the same experience of what was happening, especially in 1960s Iraq or Iran. So that's sort of how I found Thomas Crow's sort of re-historicizing of pop art very helpful for trying to make sense, also of what these artists were doing. And your point about global surrealism, especially with the Art and Liberty group in Egypt, is also absolutely apt in terms of how artists were aware of and participating in different ways with different global radical avant-garde movements. There was less of sort of history and engagement of global surrealism in Iraq and Iran for various reasons, not fully clear to me. But in terms of that sort of mythic otherworldliness, you definitely see traces of that in some of these works, but that also just might be inherently based on what their inputs were, of looking at the Battle of Karbala, where they're seeing such an echo of what they were experiencing with 7th century depictions of the 7th century battle as well, and the different ways that visual tradition had been sort of carried forth across different mediums to the 1960s as well. So, yeah, but very much that's what I've been trying to figure out, how to tell this story across the different global art world movements as well. So, thank you.
Unless there's a burning question, I am going to ask the last question because we're running out of time. A very simple answer, perhaps actually a possibility to why there is no surrealism in Iraq or in Iran. They're not as francophone as Egypt and Lebanon and Syria. I mean, Paris was not the center from which they imported the culture that they were producing, as opposed to Cairo, Beirut, Damascus, Aleppo. They were very much looking towards
and abstract
Paris.
expressionism was much more rooted in Iraq and Iran in the 50s as well, so that makes sense,
So as we now know, I mean, Talal Asad might have been sort of like a pioneer at that time. Every category is discursive, so art is discursive, which takes me to the framing of your talk, the time of your talk. You start from a period, of course, in which one would see the efflorescence of communist parties, communist movements in all the recently independent countries. I mean, you mentioned Indonesia. I'm thinking of what happened to the communists in Indonesia, but when actually the Indian Communist Party, the Syrian Communist Party, the Egyptian Communist Party, all of these were active around the same time. And it's very clear that what we are seeing is some sort of a new phenomenon in the late 40s, early 50s. But then if we move with your timeline, mid-60s, in the Arab world, the most important move that is happening is the creation of the PLO and the rise of a notion of liberation, the liberation of Palestine. And as I was looking at the evolution of the paintings that you were showing us, kept on thinking of how the artists who worked for the PLO used similar symbols, devoid of Shiite references. So there's no Zulfiqar and there's no identifiable horse, but there are horses and there are martyrs and there are people who have lost their heads. And of course, actually, there's the social realism of these bodies that we see here, which, as one of the questions I was asked you about the architects, I mean, Jawad Salim, the most famous of Iraq's artists, is someone that has introduced these sort of like muscled bodies that are really coming directly from the Soviet Union socialist realism. But I'm interested in the notion of liberation within a leftist environment because unfortunately you stopped before 1979. But I'm interested because your former advisor has worked on public art in Tehran after the revolution. And the one thing that came to my mind is that populism that started really growing in the art of the 80s and the 90s, as opposed to an art that requires much more either education in art or some sort of an understanding of abstraction as symbology. Because at this point in time, we are back to like posters where the message is direct, very propagandist, even though they are using the exact same symbols, but they're using them in an extremely direct way that, of course, actually doesn't hide at all. And perhaps simply because when revolutions win, they end up being like the regimes that they were against. So I don't know if you can comment on that discursiveness that is happening, that is the notion of liberation and what happens to it once liberation is achieved, in at least in Iran and perhaps actually in Saddam's Iraq, or at least in his mind.
Yeah, in terms of Iran, you see the Karbala paradigm, let's say, which, again, where kind of the concept really grew from, is seeing the way, the utility of it, and the embrace of images of Palestine by the Islamic Republic of Iran in their propaganda as this direct, overt, we are against the evil axis of powers of the United States and of Israel. And it's, again, very timely to be talking about this right now. But you see, that very overt directness and the embrace of the posters. So that's one of the ways in which I'm trying to understand sort of what these artists were doing, was they very much were looking towards those popular materials, the like posters and everyday materials. Like there were a lot of protests outside University of Baghdad with some of these materials, which is where Rauh al-Nasri as a professor was also like taking them from too. So the categories were very much sort of flexible in how the artists were trying to sort of bridge that gap, but still very much interested in participating in these very art modernist experiments as well. So I think that shift you see in liberation and just clear and much more overt and directness, rhetoric and in terms of visual rhetoric in the 70s and the 80s, again, is part of the destruction of the more leftist literati world from the 60s. Yeah.
This is precisely what I was hitting.
Yeah, that's very much where it sees. Is like and this history, which when I started this research, I didn't know anything about either. So it's very much a lost history of radical avant-garde and also contributions to Islamic art traditions as well. That then takes a sharp shift in the 70s and 80s onwards with the rise of the military dictatorship regimes across the region and the more militant focus to struggle on for liberation of Palestine as well. So that periodization is one that I'm trying to navigate with this material, which part of my reading of it is definitely formed and shaped by the material that comes afterwards in the 70s and 80s. Yeah.
So my suggestion to you is actually not to stop in the mid-70s. You need to push down a little bit you need a closure.
Yeah.
And you didn't offer a closure. because we are still sort of like with the possibility of some sort of a leftist victory. You have to move to sort of like the elimination of that possibility and a return to a much more populist and much more direct reference to the history, to the Islamic history, in practically all of them. I mean, yeah.
My idea for
even a revived Communist Party is doing the same thing that the Khomeini regime is doing.
So this is something we can discuss in terms of my writing the next several months, is whether a book chapter on I want to do the afterlife of the 1960s she left. Because you have some contemporary artists actually now doing this similar research and interested in this history of modern art and global art and how it changes how we think about pop art and abstraction, but also Islamic art. But then also the very potent legacy of it in visual cultures in Iran and Iraq today, in terms of political visual cultures as well. I didn't throw it in my PowerPoint, but if anyone saw the official Islamic Republic's Twitter account after Khamenei was killed this weekend, it's a painting of Khamenei with Zulfikar cloaked going across the heavens. So I can show you where to pull that up. But I mean, I thought about throwing it in here, but I wanted to stick to the Iraqi material for today. But absolutely, it's very much relevant in terms of the possibility of future-oriented Karbala, as Kazim Haidar and Diaz always talks about. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.